Over the last couple of meetings, I've asked a number of questions about the production of 155 millimeter shells. Ms. Cianfarani, I don't know if you heard the testimony that came up here, but we had the suggestion been made at this table that it's industry that is not ramping up or investing in production, and that there aren't long-term contracts available, despite 155 shells being in demand, not just to replenish our own supplies, not just to supply Ukraine, but by all other allied militaries. Can you, what can industry do to get shell production increased in Canada?
Industry is expecting to see demand signals which are firm, binding, signed contracts. These investments in production lines to ramp up will take capital investments that repay themselves in the order of 15 to 20 years, which means that they need to be backstopped by a procurement size that is large enough to effectively run the line for that long of a period of time in order for them to recuperate their investment. That's first and foremost. So signed, legally binding contracts.
So a year and a half into the conflict in Ukraine, and shell production has not gone up at all in Canada. We're the same as we were before. General Air it was very concerned about this and sounded the alarm. So why can't this happen? Is it a matter of the government making this a priority and putting the contracts out, or what will it take?
As I understand it, proposals have been put to the Government of Canada. I have not seen these proposals, but I do understand from companies, proposals have been put into the Government of Canada to increase shell production, to modify the lines, particularly for 155s. And to my knowledge, and you would have to ask the company to confirm this, but to my knowledge, there have been no legally signed contracts to increase production so that we can deliver to Ukraine.
So industry is waiting for the government?
Of course it is.
Okay, thank you. On the, you had said that the exclusion of Canada from AUKUS is a symptom of the failure of Canada to take its national defense and its procurement as well seriously. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's an example of how Canada doesn't seem to be, I think, reading the tea leaves correctly. We went into AUKUS, as I understand it, expecting, or in the words of the Prime Minister, that this is a submarine deal. Not understanding that allies speak through defense cooperation agreements, so that this is more than just a purchase of submarines. There is a whole technology stream going on behind this, where the three nations will collaborate, the Brits, the UK, and the US will collaborate to produce emerging technologies much beyond a submarine deal.
And share intelligence amongst themselves without Canada being a part of it.
Well, we're not at the table.
Right. You said that eliminating bottlenecks is part of the key to fixing procurement. Can you identify some of those bottlenecks?
Well, first and foremost, we need to, before I go into hypothetical bottlenecks, we would need to map the system. Right now, there exists no mapping of the procurement system in the public domain anyway, which means that we cannot identify where there are bottlenecks, misalignments, or perhaps duplications to make determinations on how we would change that process.
So industry doesn't know how to best go about putting together a bid or a proposal because they don't even understand.
Well, no, we understand in general how the system works, but if you actually want to do the hard work of eliminating steps which make this overall process highly complicated, you would have to take, for example, you would have to be able to have exposure to, I don't know, the 250 some steps that the Department of National Defense goes through to get a project from project conception, requirements analysis, options analysis, and then through to actual procurement. We have no visibility into those things, so we can't conjecture as to how the system might be repaired or not.
Okay, and is it only when the Prime Minister makes this a priority, will this happen? You talked about the importance of the Prime Minister. Is it the weight of the Prime Minister's office is just not behind?
We would expect to
reforming
see
procurement?
something like this in mandate letters, and we would expect it to be very directive to the ministers in charge. There are effectively 3 ministers, but a few more that play within defense procurement and export, if you want. We would expect to see it in all of the 3 minister mandate letters to take action to reduce or to take action to have procurement reform, which maybe they need to go a little bit further to say meaningful procurement reform that reduces the number of steps and time that it takes from acquisition to from conception to acquisition.
Okay, so the actual goal there to reduce times is not stated in any of the as a priority by the government.
Not as far as I know.
Okay, thank you.
Madame Lambropoulos, 6 minutes, please.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses. Mr. Mueller, you spoke a little bit about how we need to refine the procurement process, and I'm wondering if you can specify a little bit more the ways in which we can do that, and if you can let us know what is most time-consuming and what's most burdensome in our procurement process.
Well, thank you for the question. And one of the main things I spoke about at the beginning of my remarks is the need for an industrial strategy for defense and aerospace. And it goes to many of the things that were spoken about here before. Industry thrives on predictability. Industry thrives on transparency. Industry thrives on having an understanding of what and where the government wants to invest, where the government sees the key capacities and capabilities that are there. So that, to me, is fundamental right from the beginning. We need that long-term industrial strategy. And if we can get those ingredients right, industry will respond and be up for the challenge on these things. A few of the very specific pieces that I keep hearing from industry is greater collaboration between the government and industry when you are defining out capabilities that are required, when you are putting together requests for information. And I listened in attention to some of the other testimonies that you had here also. And that, to me, is a key theme. The more you can have discussions with industry earlier on in the process, industry can respond. But not only that, industry can propose new solutions, new ideas. We have disruptive technologies happening right across the board, and we seem to be always late to the game here. The other piece that I see is a huge challenge is there's a risk aversion with government on moving forward on some of these key procurements. And we need to remove some of that risk. And the old adage is fail fast, fail quickly. And that needs to be ingrained into the procurement system. There's a lot of questions back and forth, and you keep hearing from industry in particular. When you're in other countries, the procurement process and the request for information is like this, and then in Canada, it's out the door. So there needs to be some specific pieces that are happening there. But in my mind, overall, fundamentally, it's that need for that industrial strategy, having the government come out with a clear policy, a clear industrial strategy that will address a lot of the issues right across the board that we're seeing.
Thank you very much. And do you mind commenting on whether or not you think there are situations in which it's appropriate to use non-competitive contracting instead of competitive contracting? And what do you think are the pros and cons of doing so?
Well, I think that's on a case-by-case basis. And again, you need that strategy, that industrial strategy, the policy from the government to clearly define what are the key capabilities we want to have here in the country, what's the capacity we need to have, what makes the most sense. So in the absence of that, again, we're going on a transactional basis when we're recapitalizing the armed forces. And that's a huge challenge. We need to do that heavy lifting, that hard work beforehand to have that industrial strategy, to sit down government, industry, and have those discussions on where we can be best suited to support the government. And once you have that industrial strategy, those decisions on where does that procurement fit in and how can we best do it would be informed by the strategy. So have these discussions earlier, have them with industry, and that'll inform the plan moving forward.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Cianfarani, would you like to comment on that last question as well, versus on foregoing competition in certain circumstances, and what you think, or what circumstances you would think that would be appropriate in?
Sure thing. Mike is very right to say that it starts off with identifying and prioritizing what we want in this country from a security and capability perspective. And then what you do is you drive that into the outcomes you want in your procurement model. So it means we want an outcome of maintaining a certain capability with a Canadian vendor, right? We want a domestic supply of X. And then you would structure your procurement. In that case, that might be acceptable to have a sole source. You might use a national security exception for that, or you may use a clause that we have that's called not in the public interest. It's the same thing, but you may choose to sole source that because it is not in the public interest, in your national interest, to procure that in a competitive way. But you need to understand the outcome that you want first, and then you use the tools to get the desired outcome that you want.
I have less than a minute, so I appreciate the fact that you guys have come to talk to us about the need for industry and government to work together in order to come up with these plans and to better fit the needs that we have and keep going. I heard a lot of people testify the same thing, and I think that we're going to see it in our report and in our recommendations. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Madame Vignola, bienvenue au comité. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Welcome to the committee. You have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Mueller, I must confess that the aerospace situation is disturbing. We have things that are being replaced without bids, the radar system that has to be improved upon, the Kingfishers that are not flying, the F-35s, whose contracts seem to favor the Americans and less so Quebec and Canadian industries. But let me focus on the replacement of the CP-45 Aurora. I would like to find out what you think about the fact that the contracts are granted to Boeing without bids and the impact this could have on the industries of Quebec and Canada. The fact that Boeing is allowed to have the contract instead of the contract going to a Canadian company.
Well, I don't want to comment on a specific act of procurement, just because we do have members on both sides of these issues. But again, I'm going to sound like a little bit of a broken record here. It goes back to the need for an aerospace strategy in Canada. To have these types of conversations 5 years ago, to have the government clearly come out with a defined set of priorities, capability, capacity that they want to build here in Canada, and really that strategy would then inform the path forward. There's pros and cons on both sides of the issue here that we find ourselves in, but that need for a long-term strategy, absolutely critical. And the government needs to come to the table, start to have these types of conversations so we don't end up in situations where it's uncertain as to what's going on. So if you had that long-term strategy, if you had the key capabilities defined out from the government, from the Canadian Armed Forces, you could have these discussions earlier. So that to me is the core of the basis for all the procurement problems and potential different paths forward on some of these things.
If I'm not mistaken, when we talk about strategic planning, cyclical planning, we must also think of the time when the last plane was put to use. We have to start thinking about the last time the fleet was replaced. Am I mistaken?
Yeah, I would say we're recapitalizing the Air Force on a case-by-case basis, on a transactional approach right now. And without that long-term strategy that's in place, we're going to keep going through this process of a transactional approach. And that's one of the recommendations we've made in advance of the defense policy update coming forward. Having the government provide funding, have the government provide that long-term plan. Again, industry right across the country, supply chains on all sides depend on predictability, transparency, and where we're going to go next. So again, that long-term industrial strategy is absolutely key. And we see other countries doing it. The Australians, as an example, defense policy update, substantive, identifies where they're going as a country, identifying the investments, and then also straight from the top, from the Prime Minister down, a commitment for a long-term industrial strategy. How do you utilize the industrial base? And we have much to be proud of here in Canada with respect to aerospace. We're one of the very few countries that can design a plane from start to finish, and it's something we should be incredibly proud of.
Merci.
Thank you. Ms. Cianfarani, during your remarks, you talked about our ammunition needs and Canada's delays. As far as I know, Canada has ammunition factories. Weapons were sent to Ukraine, and I understand that ammunition did not go along with the weapons. But is it possible to catch up when it comes to this delay? And if an ally were to go through a situation similar to the one we have in Ukraine, what can be done so that these errors are not repeated, if there are any errors whatsoever?
So I think you heard from the Chief of Defense Staff that that yes, they haven't increased munitions through the munitions supply program since I think 2022, or they haven't purchased additional munitions through that program. So we were basically using stocks in order to send our contributions to Ukraine. Right now, around the world, the countries are getting together and they are looking at how to pool their munitions in order to get rapid production of munitions. In fact, NATO announced last week that it is providing frame contracts and firm orders for about $1.5 billion worth of ammunition. And they will continue to do that. Countries around the world are bringing their defense production, their industry arm. Anywhere from 30 to 40 companies have been showing up at a run rate in order to be able to look at how they can ramp up their ammunition to answer the call from Ukraine. To my knowledge, Canada at this time is absent from those conversations. If we want to be present at those conversations, we would need to start talking with our ammunition providers, which the United States is doing, by the way. The United States has actually given Canadian firms contracts to increase ammunition for their own purposes and for their donations to the Ukraine. So we would need to start having those conversations, and it would probably take some time, approximately 2 years before we would be in a state, I would guess, that's my guess, before we would be in a state to even be producing additional operational rounds. However,
we're going to have to leave that answer there.
Sure.
Thank you. Ms. Matheson, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller, your organization produced a report entitled Vision 2025, which called specifically for the Buy in Canada policy, procurement policy. So it's something that I've been pushing. I have a private member's bill on that, C-300, which looks to establish that Made in Canada procurement policy. Of course, we want to ensure that we're using those federal dollars to create good community building, family sustaining jobs in Canada. So can you elaborate on that specific Made in Canada approach that you outlined in your policy document? And actually, I was hoping that you would be able to or be willing to table that report with the committee here today as well.
Absolutely would be willing to table that report, and thanks for the question. I believe that report came out just before the pandemic, and there is a section there on defense procurement, and it's buy for the benefit of Canada, and that's an important distinction on that side of things. We have workers right across the country, just over 200,000 workers in aerospace. And as you mentioned, good family supporting jobs, absolutely 30 to 40% higher than the average manufacturing across the board. And our challenge at the time, and still is, to the Canadian government, in the context of a defense policy update, in the context of a long-term industrial strategy, you need to be buying for the benefit of Canada, for the workers of Canada. There's supply chains right across the country. We see some pretty significant investments, both by Canadian companies and then also international companies in that workforce right across the country. And that spans right from Vancouver Island right out to Newfoundland and everywhere in between. And one of the amazing things is that you will find aerospace companies in almost every riding in the country, everywhere. Good family supporting jobs, as you had said. So critically important. But again, it's the need for that industrial strategy. And we've been encouraging the government for years now to come forward with that strategy, to identify what are the key capabilities, what is the capacity we need to have here in the country, and then through the procurement, yes, buy for the benefit of Canada, buy for the benefit of the Canadian workers for the innovation, technological. How do you drive forward some of the research and development domestically in the country? So a whole host of pieces out there. But again, that strategy is absolutely critical, and I want to thank a lot of the other House of Commons committees that have specifically called for the implementation of the strategy, and it's my hope that that is one of the recommendations that come out of this report from this committee.
Thank you. So, I mean, we're kind of, I see a bit of a, and I hope that it isn't a contradiction, and maybe that there can be a bit more clarity from both witnesses on this, because Ms. Cianfarani, oh, I was promising myself I would get that well. Cianfarani, okay. That streamlining that we're talking about, that need, that immediate need, because things have been so delayed, in terms of procurement bids and so on, that streamlining seems to almost work against this idea, because that long-term planning hasn't happened, because that long-term strategy isn't there. So can you both talk about how you see them fitting together better, so that we're not just buying off the shelf, we're not just spending a lot of money on something like an F-35, which is now ballooning in the American system. They're already showing how much more trillions of dollars they're pouring into it for a system that isn't Canadian made, isn't part of that longer vision in that strategy.
Sure. You want to take it, or you want?
Well, maybe I could just start with that. It's not really a contradiction. You need to put that work in to define exactly where you want to go as a country with respect to defense policy, and the government thus far has been lacking in that, and that's really what's required here. And in some cases, buying off the shelf makes sense. In some cases, developmental programs make sense. But without that piece there to guide industry to help government make those decisions, it's very, very, very tough.
But if you're not investing now for that later term, and you're spending all your money on that buy on the shelf, how can you invest now?
I think there are some areas which I would call quick hits, or low-hanging fruit, where we know that we have resident capability within the country. And in the case of the war in Ukraine, we would need to restock, for example. So things like we have a lot of armored vehicles. We're world leaders in armored vehicles. So that would be identification of one capability that we know is resident in Canada, that if we were needed to source that very quickly, we could source it. And we know that that is going to be a capability that we're going to need for the long haul. Another example would be something like cyber, for example, where you have a lot of nationalistic interest. We know that it evolves rapidly. We know that there are people in this country that do it. So if you wanted to procure it as like a service, you would set up a long-term sourcing contract with the vendor that's in Canada, and you would move forward on those things. I think it's sort of a double-pronged approach, where you continue on with your strategy on one side, because it's a very long-term item. from. And in the short term, you look at where do we already know we want to keep capability in this country, where it's world leading already, and make the investment in the quick hit in that area.
Thank you, Ms. Manson. Second round, 5 minutes. Ms. Gallant.
Mr. Mueller, it took 20 years after the cancellation of the first Sea King replacement order to get the helicopters in place, the Cyclones. So given that it took that long and that the Griffins, or the CH-146s, are due to be replaced in the 2030s, should we not be placing that order now?
Well, maybe I'll give a bit of an example on this, because again, it goes to your question and then also the previous question with respect to, isn't there a bit of a disconnect here on some of these things? But when the government puts in timelines, puts in key capacity, key capabilities, and puts in the funding, as we saw through the COVID-19 example, industry can do amazing things. And it's incumbent upon the government to set forward those priorities, absolutely.
Is there an order in place yet? Yes or no, to the best of your knowledge?
I won't talk about specific procurements.
Okay,
ongoing
and with that, would it be an idea to have these key procurements put in the mandate letters of the ministers? Maybe that's what they're waiting to release.
I would say so. We're eagerly awaiting the defense policy update, and again, a clear signal from the government on funding, timelines, capacity, and capability, and then also for that industrial strategy. Absolutely key.
And Mr. Mueller, you were around here when we acquired the Chinooks and the C-130s, as well as the Globemasters. We got those in record time. What is it that we didn't do then that we are doing now, or vice versa? How do we get those so quickly when we needed them, yet it just drags on seemingly now?
Well, I think what's not happening now is we haven't identified the capacity, we haven't identified the capability. We have, in some respects, identified the budget and then the timelines. We need those ingredients all to come together, and then industry can respond in phenomenal ways. Again, I look at the COVID-19 pandemic. We had aerospace companies who'd never made a ventilator before. The government gave those ingredients, and within a few months, we had ventilators. So industry can respond if that plan is in place, and it doesn't need to take a long time.
So to both of you, were you or your representatives of industry consulted on NORAD modernization needs? Were either of you consulted before the orders went in?
Not that I can recall.
We have had a very top-level briefing on some of the technology planks under NORAD modernization, but at this point, we have not been involved in the actual planning and preparations for the equipment that's going to be purchased for NORAD mod. Some of our companies may have been involved in some of the procurements of the North Warning systems, but you have to speak to them directly.
So,
certainly, we have not at the association level been given a big plan for all the rollout for NORAD mod.
But again, you have $38 billion, huge opportunities for Canadian industry. And we need support from the government to identify those opportunities to be able to chase them.
Okay, Ms. Cianfarani, we have 4 submarines in our Navy fleet, one of which we're lucky to have at sea at any given point in time. Are you aware of any actual procurements in place? Are they even looking for a replacement?
I can't speak to the operational needs in the Canadian Armed Forces. I am aware I understand, because I have not seen a copy of the Defense Policy Update, but I understand that this asset may be discussed in the Defense Policy Update. But I have not seen, I've not actually seen it.
So it has to be in a policy paper when it's pretty obvious to most of us that we need a submarine replacement. We've had testimony before this committee saying that we already have Chinese in the Arctic, and of course there's the Russian threat, our next closest neighbor. Now, 2 weeks ago, Major General Paul Prevost told the committee that industry needs to recognize there's a global market for this here. We're working with industry now. Would you be able to comment on what's holding up the process for NORAD replacement?
For NORAD mod?
Yeah.
I have no idea what's holding up NORAD mod. Again, I'm not in the conversations. If they're sourcing something from Canadian firms, I'm most certainly not involved in those discussions.
Okay, so a general error, well, okay. Okay, that's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Mr. Fisher, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Mueller, you're in the aerospace business, and as you know and I know, Dartmouth Coal Harbour's got a pretty strong aerospace sector. So it's great to have you here, both of us being huge supporters of that sector. At this committee, in the conversation generally, very often we talk about interoperability, specifically in the NATO context. Ms. Matheson touched on buying off the shelf or buying existing platforms from our allies. I wonder if you could sort of specify to us what steps that we can take to ensure that the Canadian industrial base is integrated in these supply chains so that interoperability also supports the Canadian industry and its workers.
Well, interoperability is obviously a key requirement from the armed forces, which is there. And I should say some great aerospace companies outside of Halifax too, which are proud members of ours, and just doing some phenomenal work out there. But again, it goes back to identification through a strategy with respect to the interoperability piece, the benefits to Canada piece right across the board, and it's advanced conversations with the industry based in Canada on where the benefits would be on a lot of these procurements. And we need to do that more often. We need to do that earlier to identify a lot of these pieces that are out there. And I would say there's a huge opportunity there. You talk about NORAD modernization, the integration of the supply chain. Again, mapping it out through an industrial strategy, having government be champions for our industry in Canada to take advantage of those opportunities that are out there to ensure interoperability, to ensure the good paying jobs are coming to Canada, absolutely critical.
Thank you for that. You, in your opening statement, I think it was your opening statement, you talked about moving towards more of a risk-based approach. I had the opportunity to ask our last panel, I guess it was last Thursday, about a risk-based approach. Does your vision of moving more towards that approach include litigation? Because some countries we've heard sort of see litigation as a cost of doing business, and they almost factored into their costs or into their procurement. In Canada, I guess, does that to much of a less extent, or risk-averse. Were you thinking of litigation as well when you talked about moving more to a risk-based approach?
No, I'm not sure litigation benefits any of the parties built into the system. No, the risk, reducing the risk or identifying the risk to some of the procurements would be to reduce the complexity, say for a certain procurement. Do we need to have the 300-page, application or a 1,000-page application? Is there certain things that we can take out of it, reduce the complexity because the risk isn't there depending on the procurement? So really it's analysis of each procurement as they come out. What do we need to have? Where is the risk? Can it be managed? As opposed to having a one-size-fits-all approach for everything, which takes everything to the greatest common denominator, as opposed to lowering the thresholds, reducing some of the complexity in order to get some of these things through.
So you use the term nature of the acquisition. You want or you think that the procurement system should be designed to reflect the nature of the acquisition?
Absolutely. It depends on...
So a 300-page application form for F-35s or for something that's major, but...
It may be appropriate, absolutely, depending on the nature of the acquisition, but when it's smaller in nature, there's not as, a simple maintenance contract as opposed to the overall purchase of a particular product. You would take a look at it and then reduce down what would need to be reduced. Again, this would have to be discussed, and again goes back to that need for that overarching industrial strategy So not reducing all the risk, but taking a look in an informed approach, working with industry, reducing some of the complexity that's there.
If you had, do I have time? 20 seconds? Okay. I'll hand it
Give it
back
up because
to Ms.
you're a
Matheson. She likes the
finance.
extra seconds.
Yes, yes. Very good of you to do that. And thank you for that plug from the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. Ms. Vignola, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mueller, you talked about the astronomical volume of documents that industry has to fill out to be able to obtain a contract. I would particularly like to tell us in less than 45 seconds about technology, the technology used for procurement to submit your contracts to obtain information. Is that technology user-friendly for businesses, be they small or big industries?
Thank you for the question. And I'm not the subject matter expert on that because I don't live the procurements every day. But from what I hear from industry across the board, the complexity is high. And the back and forth that is required to put forward an application is very high and time consuming. And this back and forth of questions, back and forth between government and industry. And that's why one of the recommendations we've made is greater transparency between industry and government, and also greater, why can't we have industry spending time in government, government spending time in industry as an example, in order to foster understanding between the requirements? Because often government will come to industry and ask for something, perhaps not realizing the amount of work and time would go into that particular question. So I think greater understanding, greater collaboration is absolutely required.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cianfarani. Let me come back to ammunition. Some of our soldiers have never even fired any 94 millimeter ammunition. They have difficulty obtaining ammunition for their own practice on the practice fields here. How can we make sure henceforth that our soldiers, those we want to help, have enough ammunition so that they can have the most effective training as possible?
That time has expired, so have to work it in some other way. Ms. Matheson, 2.5 minutes. 2.5.
Plus the 20 seconds for Mr. Fisher, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right.
He didn't notarize the donation.
I just want to ask, in terms of these streamlining ideas and paperwork requirements and long-term industrial strategies, can